Imagine a city at night. The rooftops glow red. Smoke curls upward as entire neighborhoods collapse into flame. Screams echo in the distance, not from foreign invaders, but from citizens, burned alive by their own ruler. This isn't a tale of fiction. This happened in the 10th century, when a widowed empress named Olga of Kievan Rus turned grief into fire and vengeance into empire. Olga didn't just fight her enemies. She made an example of them so terrifying that no one dared challenge her again. And the method she used? Ingenious. Merciless. Almost biblical in its cruelty. But how did a woman in a brutal, male-dominated age rise to such heights? How did the widow of a slain prince seize control of one of medieval Europe's most volatile kingdoms and hold it with iron hands? Stay with me until the end of this video, because Olga's story doesn't just end with fire, it ends with sainthood, and the road between the two is darker than you could ever imagine. The stage is Kievan Rus, mid-10th century, a land both vast and fragile. Picture it, endless forests, rivers that cut through the wilderness like veins, and towns that clung to the waterways as lifelines. This was no unified empire, but a patchwork of tribes, each with its own customs, loyalties, and grudges. And over them all, the Rurikid princes claimed dominion. Kievan Rus was young, barely a generation into its rise. Its roots lay in the conquests and trade of Norse adventurers who had settled among the Slavs. They were merchants, raiders, and rulers rolled into one. Wealth flowed through their veins not from fertile fields, but from trade. Furs, honey, wax, slaves, all carried by river to the markets of Byzantium, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. Kiev thrived because it was the artery through which this wealth passed. But arteries can be cut. Power here was raw. Authority was only as strong as the soldiers who enforced it and the fear they inspired. Kings fell quickly, toppled by angry nobles or betrayed by rivals. Tribes could revolt overnight, and one bad decision might mean the end of a dynasty. The line between ruler and corpse was as thin as a blade. It was into this precarious balance that Igor, Prince of Kiev, held power. He was a member of the Rurik dynasty, heir to a legacy built by men who had carved kingdoms out of chaos. His wife Olga stood at his side, a figure little noticed by chroniclers at first. Together, they held dominion over a realm that looked strong on the surface but was brittle underneath. Their authority depended not on goodwill, but on tribute. Payments rested from subject tribes: honey, silver, livestock, slaves. It was the lifeblood of Kiev, and it kept the warriors loyal. But tribute was a dangerous foundation for power because every demand bred resentment. Every collection left behind the seeds of rebellion, and soon those seeds would bloom. Because in Kievan Rus, nothing was permanent. Not wealth, not loyalty, and certainly not life. And so the question loomed, even before tragedy struck. What happens when the strong man falls? And what happens when the one left behind is a woman? The year is 945, and the air in Kievan Rus is heavy with tension. Prince Igor, ruler of Kiev, sets out to collect tribute from the Drevlians, a powerful Slavic tribe under his dominion. For years, the Drevlians had paid, reluctantly, resentfully. But Igor's greed got the better of him. He had already collected tribute once. Dissatisfied, he returned for more. That decision would seal his fate. The Drevlians had reached their breaking point. Enough honey, enough silver, enough humiliation at the hands of Kiev's prince. When Igor arrived, demanding yet another round of payment, the Drevlians revolted. They seized him, and what followed was one of the most brutal executions chronicled in medieval Europe. The primary chronicle describes it with cold precision. Igor was tied to two bent birch trees. His legs were fastened, one to each trunk, and then the trees were released. In an instant, his body was torn apart, ripped limb from limb by the violent snap of nature itself. His cries vanished into the forest. The earth drank his blood. For the Drevlians, this was justice, an act of rebellion dressed as retribution. They had killed a tyrant, but for Kiev, and especially for Igor's wife, it was catastrophe. Olga was now a widow, her son Sviatoslav barely 3 years old. Power in Kievan Rus rested on military might, and with Igor gone, enemies circled like wolves. The Drevlians believed they saw an opportunity. A woman on the throne? A young child as heir? It was weakness in its purest form. They dared to send a proposal. Olga should marry their prince, Mal. By binding herself to the man whose people had butchered her husband, she would keep her throne, but under Drevlian control. To them, it was a practical solution. To Olga, it was an insult carved into her very soul. What they underestimated was the steel beneath her grief. They saw only a widow in mourning. What they did not see was the cold fire of vengeance taking shape in her mind. Olga would not be conquered. She would not be used. She would answer with retribution so calculated, so unforgettable, that her enemies, and history itself, would remember her name with dread. The Drevlians sent emissaries to Kiev, proposing marriage. Olga welcomed them with apparent grace. She told them, "Rest now. Tomorrow you will be honored." That night, her soldiers dug a deep trench. The next morning, the unsuspecting envoys were carried in boats and dropped into the pit. Olga ordered them buried alive. But that was only the beginning. When more Drevlian emissaries arrived, Olga invited them to bathe before the negotiations. They entered the bathhouse, only for the doors to be barred and the building set ablaze. None survived. And still, her appetite for revenge wasn't sated. She traveled to the Drevlian capital under the guise of mourning her husband. There, at a funeral feast, she served mead to her hosts. As the Drevlians grew drunk, Olga's men slaughtered them in their stupor. Thousands were killed. Each act was calculated. Each act tightened her grip. Yet even after rivers of blood, the heart of the Drevlian resistance still beat inside their stronghold, the city of Iskarostan. Olga's vengeance reached its climax with a plan so ingenious and cruel that it reads like legend. She gathered her forces and marched on Iskarostan, the Drevlian capital, the very heart of the tribe that had murdered her husband. The Drevlians, realizing they could not resist her forever, attempt diplomacy. They brought furs, honey, and silver, hoping riches might quench her fury. But Olga was not interested in wealth. She wanted something far stranger, something that sounded almost merciful. She asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household in the city. To the Drevlians, this must have seemed like a blessing. Instead of blood, the widow wanted birds. Surely this was the sign of a ruler ready to forgive, ready to move on. Eager to end the siege, they handed over the birds without hesitation. What they did not realize was that Olga was about to turn nature itself into a weapon. That night, her soldiers fastened sulfur and burning cloth to the birds' feet, and then, in silence, they released them. The pigeons and sparrows, terrified, did what instinct commanded. They flew home. Into their nests, tucked beneath wooden roofs and thatched eaves. The effect was apocalyptic. One spark became many. The entire city ignited from within, flames leaping from house to house, faster than anyone could contain. The streets filled with smoke, panic, and screams. By dawn, Iskarostan was no more than a furnace of collapsing timbers. And Olga was waiting. Her soldiers slaughtered those who tried to escape, enslaved the survivors, and seized the smoldering ruins as a warning to all. This was not just revenge, it was psychological warfare of the highest order. Olga had turned ordinary birds into instruments of terror, leaving an indelible message across the land. No rebellion would go unpunished, no insult unanswered. The chronicles say that after Iskarostan burned, no tribe in Kievan Rus ever dared rise against her again. But it leaves us with a haunting question. What does it do to a ruler's soul to build her throne not on loyalty, but on ashes and blood? The burning of Iskarostan secured Olga's position as regent. But terror alone does not sustain an empire. Olga proved she wasn't just ruthless, she was shrewd. She reorganized how tribute was collected, establishing fortified outposts called pogasti. These served as both trading posts and administrative centers. For the first time, Kievan Rus had something resembling centralized governance. Olga wasn't merely surviving, she was reshaping her state. And yet, beneath the reforms, the question lingered. Was this woman destined to be remembered only as a monster of vengeance? Or could her legacy become something more enduring? After years of blood and vengeance, Olga's story takes a startling turn. Somewhere between 945 and 957, the chronicles say she converted to Christianity. Her path led her to Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium. Imagine the scene. Olga, a widow once feared for her merciless punishments, now walking the marble halls of the Eastern Roman Empire. Gilded mosaics shimmered above her. Priests in jeweled robes swung censers heavy with incense. The emperor himself, Constantine VII, received her. And in this city where faith and power were inseparable, Olga was baptized, taking the Christian name Helena. This was more than religion. It was politics. Christianity offered her a new kind of authority, one rooted not only in the sword, but in the promise of divine order. To her enemies, it signaled that Olga was aligning Kievan Rus with the mighty Byzantines. To her people, it hinted at a future beyond endless tribal blood feuds. For Olga, who once used fire and slaughter as her weapons, the embrace of a faith built on mercy, sacrifice, and salvation was transformative. She became a bridge between two worlds, the pagan past of her ancestors and the Christian future of her descendants. But change, as always, came with resistance. Her son, Sviatoslav, who had grown into a warrior prince, flatly refused baptism. He clung to the gods of war and the traditions of his forefathers. To him, Christianity was weakness. To Olga, it was wisdom. Their conflict revealed a painful truth. Even for rulers with absolute power, the human heart could not be commanded. Still, Olga's choice planted a seed. She did not live to see it bloom, but decades later, her grandson Vladimir would make Christianity the official faith of Kievan Rus. The woman once feared for her vengeance would be remembered instead as the first saint of her people. Olga's story forces us to ask, can redemption truly erase the shadow of bloodshed, or does it live on, even in the light of faith? Olga died in 969, and here lies the paradox. The woman who burned a city alive was later canonized as a saint. The Orthodox Church hailed her as equal to the apostles. How could the same woman be both butcher and saint? For some, her early vengeance was justified, a widow defending her dynasty. For others, it was proof of her ruthlessness. What cannot be denied is that Olga was unforgettable. She proved that a woman could not only survive in a brutal world of warriors, but dominated. And in doing so, she became both a legend of fire and a figure of faith. So, who was Olga of Kiev? A grieving widow turned avenger? A visionary stateswoman? A saint in disguise? Or all of the above? Her story forces us to ask, is power ever truly clean? Or must those who seize it always wade through blood and ash? If you found yourself pulled into the fire of Olga's tale, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. We dive into stories like this every week, mysteries, betrayals, and scandals that history tried to bury. And if you think this story was dark, just wait until you hear about the queen who orchestrated witch hunts that tore her kingdom apart. That video is on your screen right now. Click it, and I'll meet you there.